Thanks so much. I think many of us who studied engineering had those moments of thinking we were not possibly going to be successful. I almost left engineering at the end of my first year at Berkeley, so I'm glad I didn't by some miracle. Anyway, let me introduce the next, our next panelist, Stefanie Johnson, who's an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she's done some really amazing, interesting, and enlightening research, which she'll tell us about.
Thank you. I wanted to start by sharing the latest scientific evidence. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but there's actually a genetic chromosomal abnormality that's been linked to company performance. It's called 2XC. And the data show that people who carry 2XC increase sales performance and increase overall earnings for companies. Although only 5% of CEOs carry this 2XC genetic mutation, they actually earn 3 times more than other CEOs. So I was really curious, if there's only 5% of CEOs who have this 2XC genetic chromosomal abnormality, how can we get more? How can we find out ways to bring these CEOs into companies? And so I actually asked my husband, who's a biology professor, how much of the population carries this 2XC? And he stared at me blankly. He said, I think it's 51%. And I said, 51%, if we know this is linked to company performance, and 51% of the population has it, why aren't we bringing these people into companies? And he said, it's because they're women, right? Because we see consistent evidence that companies have more male CEOs named David or John than they do women CEOs. Doesn't that kind of blow your mind? Do you know what percentage of the population is named David? I asked this at a company I gave this talk to, and someone said 50%. I'm like, 50%? It's 1%. 1% of the US population is named David, yet they comprise almost 5% of CEOs, and women are 51%, but make up fewer than 4% of CEOs in the S&P 1500. I like the fact that we're talking about this in tech, and I think in tech you can see it more than any other area, the benefit of having women and minorities in terms of diversity for innovation of thought. Right? And so a study was just done this year looking at the number of tech founders who actually believe that diversity increases the bottom line. And they found that about 75% of tech founders don't believe that there's a benefit to diversity. And this isn't too surprising considering that more than half of men actually think that sexism is totally over. So they see these numbers and they're like, that's not sexism. That just makes sense. Like, have you ever met John? He's awesome. So people are talking a lot about unconscious bias. And so I think the big question is, what does that mean? So I want to take you through an activity. I'm going to need some audience participation. Can someone read this top sentence for me? Be bold. Go for it.
The rock star was unhappy with the amount of alcohol at the party.
Okay, the rock star was unhappy with the amount of alcohol at the party. What does that mean? You probably have an image that comes to your mind. It's probably a man in leather pants on a table. It might be Mick Jagger, right? And he wants more alcohol. Can someone read the next sentence for me? I think someone... Perfect. The nun was unhappy with the amount of alcohol at the party. Do you get a really different image in your mind, right? And it's the exact same sentence, but you picture someone there with their arms crossed, like they're pretty unhappy. And so the context really affects what you perceive. And the same thing is true for men and women. Let me do another one. Anyone?
After weighing all the circumstances, the CEO decided to terminate a few employees.
Thank you. After weighing all the circumstances, the CEO decided to terminate a few employees. After weighing all the circumstances, the drug dealer decided to terminate a few employees, right? So I always do this in my class, and last year I had a student say, that's racist. And I said, there's no race implied, right? I mean, I didn't put a race on there, but this really shows the power of prototypes, which is your unconscious bias. You actually see an image of the person who's there, and you probably see a white male CEO and an African-American drug dealer, right? And that's not my unconscious bias. I see something different, but it shows how strong that bias is, that it actually colors what you see in the sentence. So can anyone think of a superhero? Name a superhero? Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman. Oh. Almost everyone says Superman. Because he's the most prototypical superhero. You think superhero, Superman. It's like in his name. He never kills anyone. He's really great. Think of an athlete, maybe a basketball player. Steph Curry. Okay. Other people say Michael Jordan. You probably think of an African-American athlete. This is our Denver Nuggets. I call them the Nuggies. I don't think anyone else does. But African-Americans comprise, 12.5% of the U.S. population, yet 85% of NBA players. So when you think of a basketball player, you think of an African-American individual. What's important is you don't only just think of an African-American individual, you probably all believe that African-Americans are better basketball players, right? And I gave this talk for some tech founders in Boulder, which is a very techie startup kind of place. And at the end of the talk, someone came up, yeah, great talk, but I just have to tell you something. African-Americans are better basketball players, so that's not unconscious bias. It just is. But the point is that you can't really change someone's mind about what the truth is on this, because if they weren't, then they wouldn't comprise so much of the NBA, right? So what do you think people thought in the 1950s? This is the 1950s, or 1953, 54, 55 NBA champion Minnesota Lakers. The coach's name is John. I'm not kidding. And the guy next to him is David. No, wait. He's not David. His name is actually Whitey. So that's like intense, right? But people probably didn't think African Americans were better basketball players then, right? You wouldn't think that because the prototype's not as strong. What do you think people think of CEOs? So it's the same exact argument. If white men comprise 30% of the US population, but 95% of CEOs, you probably would believe that white men are actually better leaders. So I wanted to just show how this unconscious bias unfolds and how you perceive things. And hopefully I'll get a chance on the panel to talk about some of my research on unconscious bias. Thank you.